I want you to imagine you are flying a brand new state-of-the-art airliner.
Mm.
The weather outside your windshield is completely flawless. You've got bright sunshine, a light breeze, visibility stretching for miles.
Right, the kind of day you hope for on the line.
Exactly. You are looking right at the runway threshold, fully configured for landing, and yet, in just a few short minutes, you are going to impact the ground 2,300 feet short of that runway. Today in this deep dive, we are looking at Indian Airlines Flight 605 and really how a picture-perfect day masked a lethal trap hidden deep inside the aircraft's automation.
It really is one of the most concerning case studies in modern aviation history. We are talking about February 14th, 1990. The aircraft was an Airbus A320-231 registration Victor Tango Echo Papa November.
Yeah.
And to give you, the senior line captains listening to this debrief, the exact parameters, this was a virtually brand new airframe. I mean, it had only 370 total flight hours.
It's nothing.
It's nothing. It had completed just 302 flight cycles since it rolled off the assembly line. The power plants were the highly capable IAE V2500A1 engines.
Right. And, we aren't here today to just recount the tragedy or rehash the standard news narrative. You've all read the accident reports. We want to figure out why a highly trained crew allowed the plane's brain, the Flight Management Guidance and Envelope Computer, or FMGEC, to basically command an idle descent right into the ground.
Yes, the focus has to be on the automation logic.
Exactly. We need to analyze this specific engagement of the idle or open descent mode on short final, and precisely how that triggered a complete and utter breakdown of the crew's energy management. Because the raw data of this incident is just, well, it's a catastrophic vertical profile collapse.
It is. And to understand the collapse, we first have to understand the environment they were operating in. The flight departed Mumbai at 11.58. By 12.25, Bangalore approach provided the meteorological data, and it was entirely benign.
Completely clear.
Wind was variable at just 5 knots. Visibility was 10 kilometers. Cloud cover was sparse, reported as 2 octas at 2,000 feet, which essentially means mostly clear skies with just a few scattered clouds. The temperature was a comfortable 27 degrees Celsius, and the local QNH was 1018.
Which means standard atmospheric pressure, no weird barometric traps, no rapidly shifting weather fronts, just a gorgeous day to fly. At 12.44, they were cleared down to flight level 110, and then given radar vectors for a visual approach to runway 09 at Bangalore Hindustan Airport.
Right.
But this is exactly where I want to stop and look at the psychology of the flight deck, because this presents a massive complacency trap, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The operational reality for you on the line is that benign conditions frequently mask a severe degradation in your basic instrument scan disciplines.
Yeah, how does a daylight visual approach in standard, clear weather, operating a brand new aircraft, degrade into an unrecoverable trajectory?
Well, when the weather is perfectly clear and you have the runway in sight, the threat level feels incredibly low. And that internal discipline required to rigorously monitor the automation, it can just silently evaporate.
Right, it's a critical connection to make.
We must tie those pristine weather conditions directly to the crew's mental model. Think about it. In strict instrument meteorological conditions, when you are flying through thick soup, your primary scan is locked firmly inside the flight deck.
You're practically glued to the glass.
Exactly. You are rigidly monitoring the primary flight display and, crucially, the flight mode annunciator, the FMA. You are watching what the computer is doing because you can't see outside.
You are paranoid in the clouds, essentially. You trust the instruments because you have to, but you verify everything.
Yes, but in visual conditions, like they had in Bangalore, crews naturally transition their primary scan outside the cockpit window to maintain visual contact with the runway environment. It is human nature. The profound vulnerability here is that while their eyes were outside looking at the runway, the aircraft's actual flight path was actively decoupling from the required energy state.
While they were looking out the window.
Right. The automation modes operating silently in the background were busy setting up a lethal kinetic deficit.
So let's get into the mechanics of that. Let's look at the exact automation logic that was running in the background. The official investigation identified a very specific, critical technical anomaly here.
The mode engagement.
Right, the aircraft was operating in idle open descent mode during the short final segment of the visual approach. Now, the official report explicitly notes that it is impossible to identify the exact trigger or cause for why this specific mode engaged during this crucial low-altitude period of the flight.
Which is frustrating from an investigative standpoint, but
ultimately, the absence of a definitive trigger is secondary to the operational reality.
Exactly. The hard fact is that the mode was active and it was commanding the aircraft. When we analyze the FMGEC architecture, having open descent engaged on short final represents a total catastrophic mismatch between the phase of flight you are in and the active control law governing the aircraft.
And this is where we have to question the crew's logical processing of that automation state. Because it's like they were treating the flight mode enunciator like a speedometer in a car, just a passive readout telling them what was happening.
That's a dangerous mindset.
Right, but the FMA isn't a speedometer. It's the cruise control. It's the active command authority of the aircraft. If the FMA says you are in open descent, it means the automation is prioritizing pitch to maintain your speed, while simultaneously commanding the autothrust to absolute idle.
That is the perfect analogy, and we need to trace the exact mechanical logic of open descent to truly understand the trap they fell into.
Walk us through it.
In this specific mode, the autothrust commands thrust idle. It effectively removes engine power from your energy equation entirely. The elevator is then tasked with maintaining your target speed.
So the plane is using pitch to manage airspeed, not thrust.
Precisely. Now, put yourself on a final approach. If the aircraft begins to drop below the standard 3-degree visual glide path, what is the natural physiological tendency of the pilot flying?
Well, you pull back on the stick. You pitch the nose up to arrest the descent rate and recapture the path to the runway. It's an instinct ingrained in you from your first day in a Cessna.
And that is exactly where the aerodynamic reality violently clashes with the automation logic of the A320.
Because of the induced drag.
Right. If you pitch up to correct a low profile, you instantly increase the angle of attack and subsequently the induced drag on the airframe. In a standard managed approach mode, the autothrust would sense that speed drop, spool up the engines, counteract that drag, and power you back up to the glide path.
But in open descent, that doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't. In open descent, pitching up simply bleeds your kinetic energy while the thrust remains locked firmly at idle. You are trading airspeed for altitude, but without thrust to replenish that energy, the trade is severely limited.
You're just pulling energy out of a bank account with a zero balance. And we need to remember the configuration of the aircraft at this moment. They were fully in the landing configuration.
Gear down, flaps out.
The gear was down, the flaps were deployed. The drag profile of the A320 was at its absolute maximum. In that configuration, your airspeed doesn't just gradually decrease when you pitch up without thrust. It bleeds off exponentially.
Exponentially is the right word. The flight control laws prioritize the mode they are instructed to follow, without judgment.
Right.
The autothrust was commanding idle because the FMGEC told it was in open descent. That left the wing to rapidly, inevitably approach its critical stall angle as the crew kept attempting to manually maintain the visual glide path by pitching up.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there, because this brings us to what I consider the absolute most alarming data point from the entire official report.
The mode awareness.
Yes. The pilots knew the plane was in idle open descent mode. This wasn't a silent failure of the displays. The FMA was displaying the data right in front of them. So why didn't they just push the thrust levers forward? I really want to challenge the standard industry definition of automation surprise right here.
How do you mean?
Well, usually, automation surprise implies a hidden failure, right?
Yeah.
An uncommanded mode change that the crew misses because it wasn't clearly enunciated or a sensor quietly died.
Sure, a stealth mode reversion.
Exactly. But in this event, the crew was fully aware of the active mode. They possessed the correct data. How does a pilot's brain become so tunneled that it prevents them from executing the most basic physical action in aviation, pushing the thrust levers forward, when the screen is literally telling them they have no thrust?
That is the core of the human factors analysis in this crash. We must evaluate the human interface and the concept of cognitive tunneling under immense sudden stress. The mental model of the crew had completely decoupled from the physical reality of the aircraft trajectory.
And they were just out of the loop.
Completely. You have to remember the era. This was 1990. The A320 was alien technology to pilots transitioning from older analog aircraft. The training philosophy at the time heavily emphasized trusting the automation to manage the flight envelope.
The idea that the computer knows best.
Exactly. And when you are under cognitive overload, trying to reconcile why the aircraft is sinking below the visual glide path when you feel like you are doing everything right, your brain fixates.
Right.
We have to look at the ECAM logic and the auditory environment in the cockpit during those final seconds. The aircraft systems were actually functioning exactly as designed regarding ground proximity awareness.
Right. The automated voice was aggressively calling out the radio altitudes. It was loudly declaring 400, 300, and 200 feet.
It's impossible to miss.
Those callouts are designed specifically to forcefully break a crew out of any visual fixation or cognitive tunneling. A 400-foot callout with thrust at idle and airspeed bleeding, that should trigger an immediate, almost reflexive, physical intervention from any line captain.
It should. But the profound cognitive tunneling we observe here suggests the crew was operating under a flawed anticipation of system behavior. This brings in the concept of auditory exclusion.
Auditory exclusion. Explain how that works in the cockpit context.
Well, when the human brain is completely overwhelmed by a complex visual or mental puzzle, in this case, why isn't the plane flying the path I want? It literally stops processing auditory inputs that don't solve the immediate puzzle.
So they didn't even hear the callouts.
Or if they did, the brain discarded the information. Hearing the radio altimeter callouts, but taking absolutely no corrective manual action, indicates the crew is likely waiting for an automated mode transition.
They thought the plane was going to fix itself.
Yes. They were expecting the FMGC to suddenly provide a speed protection intervention, like alpha floor, or an automatic thrust engagement to magically arrest the descent.
But in open descent.
Exactly.
No.
Based on the active mode logic at that precise moment in open descent, the automation was never going to provide that solution. They expected the aircraft to solve a problem that the current automation state was explicitly designed to ignore.
That is a chilling thought.
Yeah.
They were completely paralyzed by their reliance on the system. They allowed a perfectly good airframe to descend through the 400-foot, 300-foot, and 200-foot gates without ever actively verifying that their physical energy state was sufficient to carry them to the runway threshold.
It's a total breakdown of energy management.
Which leads directly to the kinetic impact sequence.
And the physical trajectory of those final moments demonstrates the absolute total depletion of energy. The aircraft struck the boundaries of the Karnataka Golf Club. The point of initial impact was 2,300 feet short of runway 09.
Furthermore, the impact was 200 feet to the right of the extended centerline. That lateral deviation isn't just a random detail.
No, it's highly significant.
Right. It is a critical operational indicator for you as a pilot. It proves that in addition to the vertical profile collapse, the crew's lateral navigation and visual alignment were also deeply compromised.
So why does the lateral alignment degrade?
Well, because when your kinetic energy drops to critical near stall levels, your flight controls become incredibly sluggish. The air isn't moving fast enough over the ailerons to provide crisp roll authority.
Right, the control surfaces lose their bite.
So their ability to maintain precise lateral alignment degraded right alongside their vertical path. They were practically falling out of the sky, not flying.
Let's walk through the physics of the impact sequence itself because it illustrates just how little energy they had left. After the initial ground contact, the aircraft rolled for about 80 feet. It then miraculously lifted off again for approximately 230 feet before finally coming down hard on the 17th green of the golf course.
But that brief liftoff wasn't a go-around. Thrust was never applied.
No.
That liftoff was merely the wing utilizing its absolute last marginal reserves of kinetic energy. The initial impact likely caused an involuntary, desperate pitch-up input on the side stick by the pilot.
A startled response.
Exactly. That converted whatever tiny amount of forward airspeed remained into a brief, unsustained vertical hop before the wing completely and irrevocably stalled out.
Correct. Once that final kinetic reserve was depleted, the aerodynamic stall was absolute. Upon coming down on the 17th green, the tremendous vertical force caused the landing gear wheels to dig deeply into the soft ground. The aircraft then impacted a 12-foot-high earthen embankment.
And hitting a solid wall of earth at that speed is unsurvivable for the airframe.
The sheer kinetic force of hitting that embankment caused the main landing gear and both of the IAE V2500A1 engines to be violently sheared off the airframe entirely.
Stripped of its gear and power plants, the fuselage essentially became a massive metal toboggan. It continued over the embankment and came to rest in a grassy, marshy, and rocky area.
The deceleration forces must have been immense.
The structural failure of the fuselage and the massive resulting deceleration forces led to 92 fatalities among the 146 occupants on board. Though, incredibly, 54 individuals did survive the sequence.
When the investigation concluded, the official probable cause centered directly on the human element. It was determined to be the failure of the pilots to realize the gravity of the situation and respond immediately with proper throttle action.
Despite having the data.
Right. And as we've discussed, this fatal failure occurred despite the clear, loud radio altitude callouts and their confirmed awareness of the active FMA mode.
Which forces us to pivot to the actionable takeaway for you, the line pilot listening to this debrief. Because reading about a crash from 1990 is useless unless we distill it into a strict operational standard that you can carry into the cockpit tomorrow.
The hard, non-negotiable rule that every senior captain must internalize from this deep dive is this: you cannot troubleshoot flight mode enunciator logic at 400 feet above the ground.
It's simply too late.
Way too late. If you are on short final and the active automation mode does not perfectly align with the required energy state for that specific phase of flight, you do not attempt to reprogram the computer. You do not sit there analyzing the FMGEC.
You don't try to solve the puzzle.
Exactly. The immediate verification step must be a physical, tactile intervention. You click the red button, you disconnect the automation, you take physical control of the aircraft, and you manually advance the thrust levers to ensure a safe energy profile.
Your reliance on automation must completely end the exact second the aircraft's trajectory deviates from the required physical parameters of the approach. It requires disciplined mode awareness, yes, but far more importantly, it requires the willingness to instantly revert to basic, fundamental airmanship, pitch and power.
The transition from monitoring a system to actively commanding the physical controls must be instantaneous when your energy state degrades. The modern flight deck environment is beautifully designed to provide you with warnings. It will flash, it will ring, it will call out your altitude.
But it won't fly the plane for you.
No. It cannot physically advance the thrust levers if your mental model remains locked in a state of passive observation.
So we want you to evaluate your own line operations based on the data and the psychology we have analyzed today. Think about your next visual approach.
It's a critical self-assessment.
The next time you are on short final, fully configured for landing, the weather is perfect, and that automated voice calls 400. Are you actively verifying your exact energy state and thrust response? Or has your brain just learned to filter that critical, life-saving callout as routine background noise?